next up is Laurent.
Yeah, and he's a colleague of mine, so I'm very excited that he's joining us today. Laurent, if he's up already, that'd be amazing. Laurent is a cloud advocate at Microsoft and will share with us how he got started with and how we as well can take advantage of the services that the Microsoft Cloud has to offer. And there's no better way or no better person to talk to about this than Laurent. And we'll discover the Azure Portal as well as quite a few tools that will make our lives as cloud developers better.
Okay.
Hey Laurent, thank you for joining us today.
Welcome.
Hey Flor, how are you? Hello, hello. It's good to see you.
Likewise. Virtual at least.
Yes.
Well, yeah, that's what we do these days, right?
It works, right?
Yep. I saw you last time on the last travel before everything shut down, right? I went to Amsterdam to work with you on a virtual event, so yeah.
Exactly, and that was really last minute, and I so appreciated that Laurent could join us. I mean, Ignite, the tour was canceled in a lot of places, and in the Dutch subsidiary, we thought we need to do something for the developer community to still stay connected to Microsoft. And Laurent just jumped on a flight like last minute, and I think you took like 4 out of 5 sessions that day. It was amazing that you could make it on that short notice.
Yeah, it was a fun day for sure.
Really cool.
Exactly. So go figure what he can do when he has actual prepared time. You know. So I'm super looking forward to your talk, and we'll see you on the other side with a bunch of questions.
Yes.
I bet.
So again, people, if you have questions, please leave them in the chat. You can either use the chat or the ask button on the bottom. At the end, we will forward these questions to Laurent in this case and ask them for you. So please use it.
So Laurent, whenever you're ready.
Yes, I am ready. I'm sharing my screen. Hopefully everybody can see it. So this is Discovering Azure. Hello everyone. My name, like Flo already mentioned, is Laurent Bugnion. I'm based in Zurich, Switzerland. I'm working normally all around the world and these days remote. So welcome to my living room. And this is where I'm going to talk to you about Discovering Azure. And so it's really an intro to Azure. I'm going to show you in just 20 minutes a few principles of Azure if you want, and after that we'll talk about a few of the services and especially classes of services that we have. So Azure is really huge. We have something like 60 regions, and I remember when those slides were updated almost daily with new numbers, and now they decided to say, okay, it's 60 plus regions, right? So more than 60, and I guess at some point we'll have more than 70. Makes me particularly happy that we have also regions close to where I live. For example, we have 2 in Switzerland, Switzerland North and Switzerland West. And you may wonder why 2 regions in such a small country? Well, it's because Azure allows you to always put your data in multiple locations, and sometimes you want those locations to be in the same country for regulatory reasons. For example, here, as you know, we have a lot of chocolate, yes, but we also have a lot of banks and insurances, etc., who need to keep the data in Switzerland. And the fact that we have 2 regions allows you to say, well, if something happens, for example, in the Zurich data center, I hope not, because I live in Zurich, so let's hope not. But if something would happen, then you can automatically fall back to the other region, which in that case would be Geneva. And really, you can do that all around the globe. So this is pretty cool. So definitely check the regions close to you in order to reduce the latency, and then deploy your data and your services to multiple regions so that you have also the increase in availability. And I don't know if you have ever seen the inside of a data center, and I'm very sad because I was supposed to go and visit my first data center in April this year, and then the travel was canceled, obviously. And so I've never seen the inside of a data center, but that's more or less how it looks. So it's very clean. There is one person here. Actually, most of the time there is nobody on the floor because a lot of the maintenance is automated, which means that you have really very high security. You don't have people who just walk around and can steal your servers like you would have on an on-premise data center, which you need to secure yourself. So it's just one example of some of the advantages you can get by moving your data or moving your services to Azure, where basically you're going to delegate to Microsoft, to your cloud provider, some of the tasks that you would have to handle otherwise. Things like, just the in-person security, the hardware security, control of entries, these kind of things. Things like changing a component which is damaged, physically damaged, like a server, etc. And all this happens most of the time without downtime because, again, you can replicate in multiple locations. If you put data on Azure, it's going to be always a triplicate. So we have 3 replicates everywhere so that if one server fails from a physical standpoint, then you still have the 2 others, etc., etc. So you have quite a lot of things. So it is secure. And one thing which we don't always realize is that also Azure and data centers like that in general are also actually good for the environment, because even though what we hear all the time is that they do consume a lot of electricity, and this is true, those data centers consume a lot of electricity, but Microsoft is also very, very engaged into compensating that. And for example, I'm looking at some numbers. So we estimate that it's up to 90% more efficient to run data on Azure than in your own data center in terms of electricity and in terms especially of carbon efficiency, because we are committed to also use a lot of renewable energy, things like solar panels, windmills, etc., etc. And also Microsoft has been carbon neutral since 2012, and that applies to Azure as well. But not only that, but we have been also committed to be carbon negative by 2030. And we have the commitment that by 2050, we will have removed from the atmosphere all the carbon that we have used since 1975. So there is a lot of commitment inside this direction. And there are also some interesting experiments. So I don't know if you know what that is. There is obviously the Microsoft logo on it. And as you can see from the amount of barnacles and algae on it, that has been underwater for a while. In fact, it's a data center, an experimental data center that was under the water for 2 years. And it was an experiment for us to see, like, what can we do in order to, because of course, data centers take a lot of space. So maybe we don't want necessarily to put them close to a city because that would block the expansion of the city. But we also don't want to go, in a natural area because we don't want to spoil it. So there are always new alternatives which are studied, like, for example, putting data centers underwater. And so this was an interesting experiment that we conducted, and just recently they put it up. So when we talk about cloud, and when we talk about, technology in general, and I should say, technology and especially Microsoft in general, we have acronyms. And so those acronyms, IaaS, PaaS, SaaS, FaaS, I always wanted to write WTF, but I didn't because I'm polite. And those AAS are always as a service, okay? So when we talk about IaaS, we talk about infrastructure as a service, which very often refers to virtual machines. Virtual machines are very often the first step that people take to the cloud. And because it's easy, right? I'm sure that pretty much everybody ran at some point a virtual machine. Let's say you have a Mac and you want to run Windows on your Mac, that's a virtual machine, for example. Or like me, if you want to run multiple versions of Windows on your machine, then you have multiple virtual machines as well. These days I run them in Azure, obviously, but before that I was running them on my local disk. It's very easy to make an image of a drive and put it on Azure. But of course, on the negative side, I would say you need to take care of a lot of things. For example, here as an example, the network security group, the networking, the disks. So you have a lot of power with your virtual machine, but you also have a lot of responsibility. And this is why a lot of people decide to move on to something we called PaaS, or platform as a service. And one example, and a good example that will definitely interest the Umbraco community, is of course running web applications on Azure. And this is what we call app service. I'll show you an example later, but just know that you can choose Windows or Linux. And that's pretty much what you have to worry about, but you don't have to worry about the networking. You don't have to worry about a lot of the, about patching the operating system, for example, because that's in the responsibility of Microsoft. So again, a little bit less power, but definitely less responsibility services. And other examples are things like our databases. So we have, for example, Azure SQL database, or Cosmos DB, which is a global NoSQL database, so non-relational database. We also have open source databases that can run on Azure database, things like PostgreSQL, MySQL, or MariaDB, for example. And so it's a good compromise between going all into the infrastructure as a service and having very big, how should I say, very big efforts to maintain your virtual machine. And on the other hand, you still have quite a lot of power over that because you can totally control and especially monitor everything. One step further would be what we call SaaS, which is software as a service. And so an example comes to mind, Office 365. It means that you can go into your web browser and type a Word document and share it with somebody else who is opening on his Word in the desktop, for example. And so here you have very, very little responsibility. You also don't have much power over it. You can type a document, but that's pretty much what you can do. Finally, I want to mention FaaS, or Function as a Service, also called serverless. On Azure, we have two very nice solutions to that. We have Azure Functions. I'll show them in a moment. We also have Logic Apps, which is fantastic. It's a place where you can basically create an application without writing code, with almost no code or very little code. And so very interesting to observe. You go into a designer and you open that. So let's see a demo. And for the demo, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go to the Azure Portal. And the Azure Portal is one of the multiple places that you can go to create services on Azure. You can also do things in what we call the Cloud Shell. And so, for example, the Cloud Shell is basically a console environment that you open in your web browser. It's taking just a moment to connect. And as you can see, I can select here Bash or PowerShell. So depending on what you prefer. So if you're more of a Linux person, you probably prefer Bash. And then on that, we have our AZ command line interaction, which means that every time I type AZ, and for example, AZ Cosmos DB create, it's going to allow me to create an Azure Cosmos DB in the browser. I can totally maintain everything, which means that you can also run scripts. The Cloud Shell is really cool because it also has actually a file system associated to that. And so, for example, I can totally do ls here. And then as you see, I have some things. And you may wonder, why do you have something? Because it's a web browser. Well, because there is a file system associated to that. And it's not linked to a session. It's going to be preserved over session. So at any time, I can go and I can say, for example, Nano even, and then suddenly I'm in Nano into my web browser here. Nano is a very simple editor for Linux. So I'm going to go back here. We are not going to go into the Cloud Shell more in detail here. But what I want to show you is, first of all, a virtual machine. And so virtual machine, like I told you, it's very easy to understand what it is because it's basically a computer running in the cloud. But it would be exactly the same if it was running on my other computer and I wanted to connect to it. So this is the machine here. It's a Windows 10 machine, like the name shows, but we have tons and tons of images. We also have very big virtual machines, things with a lot of GPU, for example, if you need to do video encoding, etc., things like that. One example is that very often we have virtual machines in Azure with OBS on them. And like this, we don't need to deploy OBS to a local machine. We connect to that virtual machine. And then we take advantage of the huge bandwidth that we have on Azure, but also of the power of the virtual machine. So I can connect to this machine. You see that I have some examples, some alternatives. I can go with SSH, RDP, or Bastion, which is a secure protocol. And I'm going to go and request access. The reason why I need to request access here is because this machine is protected by our policies. And so the RDP port is actually closed by default. So now I am saying, okay, I request access. Access was granted for my IP address. And then I'm going to download, as you can see, the RDP file, which is just like a standard process that you would use to connect to a virtual machine. So you have this RDP file. And then after that, I'm going to open that into the remote desktop connection. So it's initiating the remote connection. And then once this is done, I can connect and work in that just if it was my own machine, maybe with a little bit more latency, because obviously there is a network in between. Sometimes it fails the first time. That's OK. We can try again. So let's go back to our downloads and reopen the RDP file. What happens here is that probably even though access was granted to me, but sometimes it takes just a few seconds to actually propagate. So now I can enter my credentials. Voila. Okay, password. I think I typed properly. No, I didn't. Okay. Oh, yes, I did. All right. Cool. So now I have the virtual machine starting, as you can see. And so one thing I did, for example, is install Visual Studio into that. And that allows me to try, for example, to maintain, for example, old versions of Visual Studio. Like if I have a version of technology which requires Visual Studio 2012, for example, I probably don't want that to have that on my main machine. So I can totally do that. I can also do all kinds of things. One thing between you and me is that on this machine, for example, I have Node.js installed because I don't want to have Node.js on my main machine because it's a very heavy environment. And since I almost don't do JavaScript, if I happen to do JavaScript, then I connect to my VM quickly. It also allows me to have, for example, a collection of tools installed if you're a consultant per client. You say, okay, for this client, I need this set of tools. For this client, I need that set of tools. And like this allows you to be very, very flexible. So it's just a standard machine. Obviously, we also have Linux machines, so you can totally connect to that. So if you go to create a resource here, and then after that, you search for a VM. And so we have, for example, down there, we have virtual machine as a category. I forget where it is now, so let's just look for it. For example, I can search for Ubuntu, if I know how to type. And here I have, for example, Ubuntu. I have different versions of Ubuntu that I can select. And then you would go and create that. You get the machine. It's just a normal machine, meaning that don't forget to switch it off, because as long as it runs, you're going to get billed. But on the plus side, if you switch it off, then you're not billed anymore. And like this, you have a way to save money. Okay, because the time is short, I want to move to a platform as a service. And so let me show you an app service. So this is a website. It's actually a production website. It's my private website, galasoft.ch. And here, as you can see, I have some stuff which is running. And a few things you can do here is set some configuration. You can set some identity for your application if you want your application to be able to access other Azure services. Here I have all the environment variables which are defined. You can, of course, go and set up a custom domain so that you have your custom domain set. As you see, I have a few here, TLS, SSL settings, etc., etc. But more importantly, and I think this is really important for everybody who does anything with websites, we also have amazing monitoring capabilities. And so if you go into application insights, which is here enabled for this website, then you will see a lot of things, including, for example, what happens if there is a failure. And then after that, you can dive into the failure, and then you can see what's going on. You have an application map. So if you have a web application which is using multiple databases, for example, that can be super interesting because it's going to allow you also to see, for example, the performance of your databases. So that can be really smart. We also have live metrics which show you live how your application is doing, like the number of requests, the latency, maybe the number of errors, etc., etc. So here you see some of those graphs. And really, if you go and hit the website, you will see that suddenly you get a number of requests which are getting served. So here you see that I have actually a number of requests which are coming as we speak. People are connecting to my site. So all kinds of things which make your life easier. And so much so for platform as a service. Like I said, we also have SQL database. We also have Cosmos DB for data. We have Azure storage. If you have a lot of images, this is very cheap, etc. But one thing I really want to show you is also, oh, and by the way, one thing I wanted to tell you, you can also pin those graphs to the dashboard. So this is my dashboard here, as you can see. And here I have, very importantly, I have HTTP 500. And so I have a few errors which happened this morning. And I will need to go and investigate. And as you can see, this is linked to the data in, so to the number of requests. And of course, those slides are correlated. So if I pass the mouse here, you see that it is following. So it really allows you to monitor all that. So let's talk about functions, Azure functions. So functions are serverless, which means that if you create an Azure function, you're not going to select like I do if I select an app service. If I select an app service, I'm going to say, well, I want it to run ASP.NET 4.7, or I want it to run .NET Core, or I want it to run Node.js 12, etc., etc. Because even though it's not infrastructure as a service, I still have some level of control over the server and what it runs. But here with serverless, like the name says, well, we don't have control, but we also don't have responsibilities. It's a model where you pay as you go, meaning that you're not going to be billed if the function doesn't run. If you have 1,000 requests, we are just going to give you 1,000 instances of functions. If you have 1 million requests, we just give you 1 million instances of functions. So it's going to scale up automatically, and you don't have to worry about that. Again, in app service, if you want to scale up, you need to set it up. And in infrastructure as a service, if you want to scale up, you have to do it pretty much manually. We have scale set and things like that. But it's going to take minutes for a new virtual machine to start. On the other hand, here on function, it's just going to start almost instantly. And like this, you have a very nice situation. So I can go here and say, okay, I want to add a function. Definitely not something you would do in production. Working in a web browser is a little bit cumbersome, but it allows you to try things out. So if you want to just see how it works, and then we have those triggers. Triggers allow me to say what is going to start the execution of the function. And here, as you see, we have HTTP. So it's for an HTTP API, it's perfect. Timer trigger if you have a recurring function going on, blob storage if you want to react, for example, to an image being uploaded to an Azure storage account, and then you want, for example, to run some cognitive services, some artificial intelligence on it. Azure Cosmos DB trigger if you want to change something, if you want to react to a change in your database. And so here I can go and I can say hello Doug, for example. And I'm going to just create the function. I don't go too deep into the detail because of time. And that's going to allow me to edit the code directly in the web browser. Now here, I'm a C# person, so I selected .NET and C# as my favorite environment. And so here you see the function, it is ready to run. And if I go to code and test, and again, it's not something I would do in production, but I am able actually to code directly in the web browser. In reality, you would probably do that into Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. And then after that, deploy. You can test everything locally, which is really cool. So here we see the function. It's going to take here a name from the query. It's going to tell me if I don't have a name, it's going to say everything's okay, but please pass me a name. And then if I have a name, it's going to tell me hello. And here I type hello Doug, for example, with a name. Now I can save, and it's already deployed. It's already running. It's serverless. I don't need to do anything else. I'm ready to run this function. So I can go and take here the function URL. Since it's a get, I can simply put it in the web browser. I didn't put a name in the query, so it's going to tell me it works, but please give me a name in the query string. So why don't do that? Why don't we do that? I'm going to say hello to Floor. Voila, so if I can type properly, and now it's going to tell me hello Doug, Floor. Well, hello from Doug, I should have written. Actually, why don't I fix that since I'm here? So I'm going to go here and say hello from Doug. Way better. I'm going to save. It's already deployed. I can refresh. And as you see, the change already happens. So that's the power of serverless, where you really don't have to worry about these kind of things. All right, this was a really, really short introduction to Azure. We have hundreds of services that you can use, so I'm not going to go further. If you want to try things out by yourself, there are two places I want to recommend you to go. The first one is the Azure Documentation. This is docs.microsoft.com/Azure, or here you have a link. This is where we have everything. And we also have quick starts and tutorial and 5-minute quick starts, which allow you to really very easily get started into a topic. But also on Microsoft Learn, which is our learning platform, you have the Azure Fundamentals. And my team was very involved into creating those. We have exercises. We give you sandbox so that you can try by yourself, for example, to deploy a whole-blown website with a database and try things out by yourself. If you want to get the slides with all the links, you can go to this address or just scan the QR code if you still see it on the screen. And my Twitter handle is down there, Bugnion, L-B-U-G-N-I-O-N. My DMs are open, so if you want to talk even in private, I'm totally able to do that. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer questions if we have some.
Thank you, Laurent. We do have some questions.
Yes, quite some.
All right.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, there was a lot of chatter, and I think you can notice that, on our end of the world, it starts to get creep towards lunchtime when people are talking about, underwater data centers all the time, and we're figuring, is there any way that you could do like a sort of a trip to the underwater data center? Do you need scuba gear for that?
So it so happens that I'm certified scuba diver, but I can also imagine that the location is probably a little bit protected. So typically we don't disclose the exact location of data centers for obvious security reasons.
Obvious reasons.
And unfortunately, right now, this data center is not underwater anymore because after the 2 years experiment, they pulled it out to see, how it was.
How it behaved, yeah.
Exactly. So I don't think you can. But that said, probably if you do any diving like me, you know that the best place to see wildlife is in artificial reefs, which are usually a boat sank. And I have amazing memories of going to the Philippines and diving into a World War II wrecks with amazing wildlife. And so I can totally imagine that in the future, those data centers are going to turn into artificial reefs, and that's going to be interesting. I think that part of the experiment was really to see how can we have a data center with really minimal to no maintenance, right? Because you don't want to disturb the thing once it's underwater. So yeah, definitely an interesting experiment. There are tons of reports online if you want to read more about that.
Absolutely, thank you. I'd also love to ask you to share the links that you shared in your last slide on the chat, if you can join the chat later on.
Yeah, absolutely, I'll copy that as soon as I'm done. The chat is actually running on another machine, so I'll just switch as soon as I'm done and I'll share that with pleasure.
Talking about other machines, because there was one of the questions was, why would you use a VM instead of using code spaces for this?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So the easy answer is that when I set this VM up, I actually didn't have CodeSpace yet because CodeSpace was just released very recently. And it raises really a very good question, which is, would I do that again? And probably not with Visual Studio 2019. I think the scenario where we have to maintain legacy environments and maintain those development environments with Visual Studio, I don't know, 2010, 2012, I know that some people are still maintaining ASP websites. I was reading in the chat, Probably that could be a scenario where CodeSpace is not going to be able to really help you. But yeah, CodeSpace is amazing. For those who don't know, basically we are running Visual Studio as a service on Azure, pretty much, and then you connect with either in the web browser for the UI, or you can have like a shell of Visual Studio, which is like a very, very lightweight install, and then which connects to that. So that's the explanation I would have. But really, mostly it's just that it's a relatively old VM that I've been using for quite a while already, and that was before CodeSpace.
Okay, that is a very fair answer.
Yes.
Can't argue with that.
Yes. So maybe another question is that usually when people talk about cloud, they are also talking about how much it costs and that it's very hard to keep things under control. Do you have any tips for the people watching right now to keep your costs under control? No,
absolutely. And I think the difficulty and a lot of the discussions come from the fact that it's a totally different way to pay for your services, right? So if you have a data center, typically you know that every month you're going to pay so much. If you have your own data center, then you know that you have to advance the money. It's what we call capital expenditure, right, as opposed to operational expenditure. And so we have a lot of places where you can go to find help on estimating the cost. One place, if you are, before you run to Azure, before you do the migration, you can go to Microsoft.com/TCO, I believe. Basically, it's our Azure Tco, if you look for it in a web browser. If you Google with Bing, like Scott Hanselman would say. And so the TCO is the total cost of ownership. It's going to ask you questions about what are you running right now, how many servers, how many databases, how much capacity, etc. And then it's going to give you an estimate of how much the migration would cost. So that's what you do pretty much before the migration. After the migration is done, we have the Azure Cost Management Center, and this is where you can see at any time how much you spent already for the month and an estimation of how much how much you're going to spend for the month based on previous months and based on your current consumption. And of course, consumption model, right, it's a very fair model if you think about it, because you're going to, like the serverless model, for example, you're going to pay for what you actually consume. If you don't consume, you don't pay. If you don't earn, you don't consume, so you don't pay. But if you consume a lot, we also assume that you earn a lot, and so it's only fair to compensate, right? So it's a very different thing. So yeah, the Azure Cost Management Center is a good place to go. And finally, also the Azure Pricing Calculator. It's a tool which is pretty detailed, where you can run some simulation. Even different regions sometimes cost differently. Like in Switzerland, it's you know, us Swiss, right? It's always a little bit more expensive to run things here. There are reasons. It's because of the proximity, et cetera, et cetera. So definitely you can run those simulations into the Azure Pricing Calculator and see. I would say, especially in the beginning, after the first migration, be very aware of those costs, because we have some best practice. And if you run the Azure Cost Management Center, we're also going to give you some recommendations, like, for example, telling you, oh, we noticed you didn't use this VM during the night. For example, you should set auto shutdown, for example, something like that, which means that every, I don't know, 7 p.m. or whatever you set up, the virtual machine is going to shut down automatically. So there are a lot of best practices, and we have a lot of white papers and explanations and documentation about that. Definitely recommend that you check our docs. But yeah, those resources are going to help you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
That's a great and elaborate answer. Thank you again, Laurent, for joining us.